So in the past two or 3 months, maybe even before that, really, the signs that the Tories were collapsing in poll ratings, not just because of Boris Johnson, but out of the numerous mistakes that they have made being in government and really since coming to government since 2019, have been very, very plain for all to see. And remember, this is a government that has talked big about all these big promises that it was going to make with all these fascinating slogans of getting Brexit done. But Brexit is far from done. It's causing huge amounts of problems, as we've talked about before on this channel. Leveling up, again, a big promise, but it cannot be kept unless the government is actually serious about leveling up the country. And that involves investing hundreds of thousands of pounds into the country. They ain't interested in that. They pretty much spelled it out in their own report that they ain't interested in doing that. Transport, HS2, not getting the northern leg, a massive blow to infrastructure and indeed again leveling up the north. The list goes on and on and on. But especially in recent times, we've obviously seen the polling, which is again incredibly confident for Labour, saying that if there was a general election held this week, very likely Labour would beat the Conservatives, but they wouldn't be in a position to be able to form a majority parliament. And as we've said before, it does look like that Labour is going to have to just through pragmatic necessity to form a progressive alliance to defeat the Conservatives. Now, of course, I've said that any progressive alliance should come with the caveat that we do change the electoral system to from the first past the post to a progressive vote system, mainly, as I've said before, to like a single transferable vote. That's what I would like to see for this country. It would be a massive step forward. Or changing the House of Lords to like a House of Regional Elected Representatives would also be a massive step forward as well. So let's go diving into this, because there is a big hope of hopium to be had from this. So as always, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help support the channel. So let me just, there we go, over to The Guardian. There we go. So this, as we said, comes from The Guardian with the title of Memo to Labour. You still can't beat the Tories without the Lib Dems and Greens. So, oh, the oxygen of optimism. After 2 years of thinking the Conservatives can't be beaten for another generation, Labour has finally had its head above the clouds. It is in ahead of the last round in the Conservatives in some polls by as much as 10 points. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine might tamper with those numbers a little, but the opposition is now in the game. The tide has turned. Only it hasn't. In fact, it would not be going too far to say that the current good showing for Labour, which seems to be largely based on Boris Johnson's bumbling of the Owen Paterson and, of course, Partygate affairs, is the worst thing that could have happened to Britain's progressive forces. It takes their eye off the need to be ruthlessly methodical in unravelling the Tories' parliamentary majority. Already, the newly buoyant Labour is stepping into the traditional, do we really need these smaller parties mindset, making warm noises towards other parties like the Greens and the Lib Dems when it thinks it can't win an election on its own, yet dropping them like a hot potato when it thinks it can. But the reality is that Labour cannot win by itself in the current electoral landscape. The party needs to gain at least 120 seats to have a working majority, a nearly impossibility at the current electoral landscape. So it will have to rely on the support from at least one other party for that. And there will be a price to pay, as it may very well face up to that now. Even if one of the piece of the constructive news comes with alarm bells, Labour and the Lib Dems have clearly agreed a non-aggression pact, which makes sense. But they have seemingly failed to reach any agreement about the use of the proportional representation. In the Financial Times article in which the cooperation agreement was leaked, the unnamed advisor close to Ed Daley was quoted as saying this: We are trying to get Labour to think about that now. This is nowhere near good enough for either the Lib Dems or for the British politics. The Lib Dems finally have some leverage now. They should use it while they can to seek assurances on electoral reform. If the failure to try and nail down in the PM Lib Labour agreement rings one alarm bell, the basic error of the two parties, excluding, of course, the Greens, should ring another. In the reworking of the 1960s comedy sketch, in which John Cleese, Ronnie Barker, and Ronnie Corbett play the upper, middle, and working class stereotypes, Labour is currently looking down on the Lib Dems, who in turn look down on the Greens. And when Labour deigns to talk to the Lib Dems, both hope that the Greens will just know their place. Only they won't, and nor should they. The Greens do feel shafted by the 2017 elections when they stood aside for numerous Labour and Lib Dem candidates only to get no credit, amid the talk of progressive alliances to stop Theresa May getting a whopping majority. The Greens fielded around 100 fewer candidates than in 2015 and ended up losing more than £80,000 as opposition party funding is linked to the number of votes cast. There's enough representative in the Green ranks to last a generation. So, deigning to fight against Labour and the Lib Dem candidates who could beat the Tories is understandable, as they did in places like Shrew and Lees last time in the election. But it is also futile. The obvious Green target at the next election is to win a second MP to bolster the Caroline Lucas, who has held Brighton Pavilion since 2010. Yet, a look at the electoral map shows no seat anywhere near the Greens can actually reach. The only way they could pick up a second MP would be as a result of some freak event, like a big name standing for them in a winnable seat, like David Attenborough in the Isle of Wight. Or is Lucas even raising a double or quits gambling game by staking her reputation on standing somewhere else and hoping Greens do keep Brighton? In short, it's not going to happen, but environmental issues are now prominent enough that Greens will peel off votes from a very significant number of Labour and Lib Dem candidates and allow Conservatives to win, especially as the Greens do set to outperform the 2015 watermark of a 3.8% of the popular vote. This is the new car crash that the traffic light parties are indeed headed for. It's happened before, but if they seem to have learned nothing, the landscape is obviously complicated by the nationalists, who could very well hold the balance of power. But the seething hatred between Labour and the SNP means that they will refuse to face the fact that the Labour-SNP cooperation could very well be crucial. To avoid the next car crash, a progressive alliance of parties needs to do two things. Firstly, they must bring in the Greens into that Lib-Labour non-aggression pact. Second, the Lib Dems should be driving a hard bargain with Labour for electoral reform. With a proportional voting system agreed, and now a roadmap for that implementation will finalise well before the election. Ideally, a commitment to electoral reform should be part of the platform of all the core parties to make it into Labour, Lib Dems, and the Green manifestos, so that anyone wanting to vote for one party can vote tactically for another and still support the main themes. The list of the core policies doesn't have to be long. It could just be 4 or 5, and they can be worded differently in each manifesto. But the bedrocks have to be PR for the House of Commons. It is no magic bullet, but it's one way the smaller parties can cooperate. The Greens in particular have no incentive to pull back from their spoiler campaigns if they're not offered PR for Westminster. And Labour has so much to gain by embracing it, not just electorally, but to ensure the achievements of a Labour-led government aren't undone in the next swing to the right. The brick wall should be looming into view into the windscreen. And of course, there is just enough time for the opposition parties to swerve, but they have to open their eyes first. And I've talked about this so many times on this channel before, I do think a progressive alliance needs to be formed. I think that is not definitely needs to be happening at the next election. I'm really glad that there is a non-aggression pact between Labour and the Libs. But again, I do agree wholeheartedly the Greens need to be brought into that, because they've got no. If they get left out of that pact, well, then they might as well run their spoiler campaign, and they will peel away votes from Labour and from the Lib Dems. And that could very well cause the Conservatives to win in some seats which they need to win. So they need to, well, win those seats, especially if they want to form that progressive alliance. And I do agree with the wholehearted fact that, again, PR needs to be at the very core of this manifestos. I think the next election should be fought on a very, very few key core issues. And I think they're already seeing what the potential they are going to be. First of all, electoral reform for the Commons, absolutely necessary. Again, funding the NHS, again, it's a complete no-brainer. And then energy. Look at the green energy look at the energy crisis that we're currently facing at the moment. This can be solved very, very easily by a hard investment into renewables that can be online within at least 2 years, compared to 15 years for fracking and much longer for other things like coal and oil. So there's some key issues and core issues right there that all the parties can get behind on and agree on. And if they can get their heads together and agree to this, then we could actually see the possibility of, again, our voting system changing for the far better, because we've seen it. All the numbers show that under a PR system, the Conservatives will never, ever get more than about 33, 34% of the vote. So unless they do some power sharing agreements in the PR system, the Tories are never going to be in power. That is why we must push forward for a change to the voting system and a roadmap of how that is going to do well before we've still got time to be able to do it and lay out that groundwork for it. And I think if we can do that, then we've got some really good success of almost having an outright victory almost at the next general election. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe buttons. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a notification link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.